Okay, so are you ready for a deep dive into a case that'll have you questioning everything you think you know about the line between sanity and, well, the supernatural?
Oh, yeah. I'm fascinated by cases like this where you have to ask yourself, is there more to the story than meets the eye?
Our subject today is Thomas J. Hooper, a seemingly ordinary librarian who turned into, well, a horrifying figure practically overnight.
Librarian?
Yeah, exactly.
Oh, okay.
He shocked this peaceful community, Cold Pines, with some really brutal crimes. But the real twist comes in with his defense.
What was that?
Hooper claimed he was following orders.
Orders from who?
Not from a person, but from something he called the void.
The void. So we're talking potential supernatural influence in a court of law. That's a tough one for any legal system to grapple with. I mean, how do you even begin to prove or disprove something like that?
That's exactly what we're going to explore in this deep dive. The evidence, the testimonies, the whole courtroom drama. We're going to put you right there in the jury box and let you decide. Was Thomas Hooper a puppet controlled by some otherworldly force? Or was this void just a product of his own mind? Kind of a terrifying thought either way, right?
Absolutely.
So the crimes themselves completely shook Cold Pines. We're talking about a place where everyone knew, violence was practically unheard of. And Hooper, he'd been their librarian for like 30 years.
Wow, so this wasn't just some random act of violence. This was someone deeply embedded in the fabric of the community. It must have been absolutely shattering for everyone who knew him.
Imagine the shock. You go to this guy for book recommendations, your kids go to his story time, and then suddenly he's at the center of this horrific investigation.
Yeah, it really makes you question how well we can ever truly know someone.
And speaking of unsettling, Hooper's initial testimony was, well, pretty chilling. He was like a bundle of nerves in the courtroom, constantly looking over his shoulder, whispering to himself.
What was he saying?
He kept muttering about these voices from the void, giving him orders. He was convinced he was on some kind of mission and had to follow through with these terrible acts. I can only imagine what the families of the victims were going through, forced to sit there and listen to this.
Yeah, that's the human side of this whole thing that often gets lost in the legal arguments. The trauma, the grief, the search for answers, and then you have this guy claiming he's not even in control of his own actions. Must have been incredibly difficult for them to process.
This case really throws a wrench into the whole idea of the insanity defense. I mean, how do you prove someone was incapable of understanding their actions if they're claiming they were under the influence of something beyond human comprehension?
It's a legal and a philosophical nightmare.
The prosecution was adamant that the void was just a fabrication, a way for Hooper to avoid taking responsibility. They brought in a psychiatrist who testified that Hooper had a long history of mental illness, documented delusions, the whole 9 yards.
So the prosecution's argument was basically that what Hooper was calling the void was really just his own mind playing tricks on him. Makes sense from a medical standpoint.
Exactly. But hold on, because the defense team, they had their own expert witness. And this is where things start to get really interesting. They brought in this paranormal investigator, someone who'd spent years researching cases just like this. And he was convinced that the void was a real deal.
So now you have this courtroom, this place designed for logic and reason, being asked to consider the possibility of a reality beyond what we can see and touch. That's got to create some tension.
You got that right. This expert presented all this research on interdimensional forces, telepathic communication, all sorts of stuff that sounds like it's straight out of science fiction. He even drew parallels to other cases where people claim to have been influenced by external forces.
So the defense was basically saying, yeah, Hooper might have a history of mental illness, but what if that illness made him more susceptible to something real, something beyond our current understanding? That's a really compelling argument.
It definitely complicates the narrative. And then to make matters even more complex, guess who else entered the picture?
I don't know who.
A religious scholar.
A religious scholar, okay.
He testified that the voices Hooper claimed to hear might be demonic or even angelic. He even suggested that Hooper could be some kind of chosen vessel.
Wow, so now we're adding a whole other layer to this case. We've gone from psychology to the paranormal and now to theology. Talk about a legal puzzle.
Right. It makes you wonder how the jury was supposed to wrap their heads around all of this.
Yeah, were they supposed to weigh scientific evidence against supernatural claims, against religious interpretations? How do you even begin to do that?
It really highlights the limitations of our legal system when it comes to dealing with the unknown. I mean, we're used to looking for concrete evidence, clear motives. But what happens when the driving force behind a crime might be something completely outside our realm of experience.
It's almost as if Hooper's case is forcing us to confront the very nature of reality itself. What if there are forces at work that we just can't explain or even perceive?
Now add to all of this the fact that Hooper's behavior in the courtroom started to become increasingly erratic.
Oh, really?
Oh yeah, it was like he was being pulled in two directions. He started to talk about seeing lights and hearing sounds, claiming that the void was communicating with him right there in the courtroom.
And this was the same guy who had spent 30 years surrounded by books in a quiet library. It's almost like the order and structure of that environment somehow provided a contrast, a backdrop for these chaotic experiences he was describing.
Right. There's something really eerie about the image that was presented in court. An empty library at night shadows, dancing with these flickering blue and green lights.
Yep, it's like a scene out of a horror movie.
Were these genuine glimpses into another dimension or just the hallucinations of a troubled mind?
And how can you possibly tell the difference? That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
It really is. And it's a question that brings us to the heart of the mystery surrounding Thomas J. Hooper and the void.
It's like this case ripped a hole in the fabric of our legal system. You know, the whole thing rests on the idea that people can choose right from wrong, that we have agency over our actions. But what if something else is pulling the strings? Especially something you can't see or prove exists? It throws the whole concept of justice into question.
Exactly. If something like the void is real,
Yeah.
and it can actually manipulate people into committing these horrific acts, well, then where does responsibility lie?
Yeah.
Can you really hold someone accountable for something they did under the influence of something like that? It really makes you think about the limits of free will, right?
Absolutely. The defense actually used that very argument. They were basically saying that Hooper was a victim, that he was powerless to resist this entity that had taken control of him.
Which is kind of a terrifying thought in itself, right? To think that we could be vulnerable to something like that, something that could override our own thoughts and impulses.
It's a chilling thought. They pointed to his past. I mean, he had no criminal record, led a quiet life, practically a pillar of the community. They argued that something drastic, something external had to have happened to make him snap like that.
But the prosecution, they weren't buying it. They kept coming back to his mental health history. Their argument was basically that this was a case of a man driven to violence by his own internal struggles, not some external force. The psychiatrist who testified basically said that Hooper's delusions were so strong they could have completely distorted his perception of reality.
It's a classic clash of perspectives. You have the prosecution working within the bounds of the law, looking for a rational explanation. And then you have the defense essentially asking the court to consider something beyond those boundaries, something that might not even fit into our current understanding of the world.
It must have been mind-boggling for the jury. How do you weigh scientific evidence and legal precedent against claims of supernatural influence? I mean, it sounds like something out of a horror movie, but there they were, having to make a decision based on the evidence presented.
And then, as if things weren't complicated enough, things took a really dramatic turn during one of the later hearings. The courtroom was dead silent, everyone on edge, and suddenly Hooper just erupts. He starts shouting about the void being right there in the courtroom, watching him.
No way.
It was chilling. Apparently, he started shouting, "They made me do it! They made me do it!" over and over.
It's like something out of a nightmare.
And then he starts muttering about preparing for something. It was as if he was implying that there was more to come, some larger plan orchestrated by this entity.
That talk about preparing really adds another dimension to the case. It suggests a level of premeditation, a purpose that goes beyond just a random act of violence.
Right. It almost makes it sound like Hooper was just a pawn in this larger game. But what game? And who's playing? Those are questions that nobody could really answer.
So what did the prosecution make of this outburst?
Well, they saw it as more evidence of Hooper's deteriorating mental state, of course. To them, the talk of preparation was just another delusion, another way for him to try and shift blame and avoid responsibility. But for anyone who was already considering the possibility of the void, this outburst must have been incredibly unsettling.
It's like he was confirming their worst fears.
Exactly. It was like he was saying, this isn't over, there's more to come. And that's where the case starts to really mess with your head. Because it forces you to ask, what if Hooper's right? What if there are these forces at work that we can't even comprehend?
It makes you question everything you thought you knew about reality.
It does. Unfortunately, the court wasn't equipped to answer those questions. Despite Hooper's claims and the testimony of the paranormal investigator, the judge ultimately ruled that he was mentally incompetent to stand trial.
So what happened to him?
He was sentenced to life in a psychiatric institution. But the story doesn't end there. Even in confinement, Hooper continued to talk to himself, to this unseen presence. It's like the void followed him, never let go.
So even though the legal system did what it was designed to do, the question of the void remains unanswered.
That's the haunting part, isn't it? Whether you believe in the void or not, the fact that it had such a profound impact on Hooper's life, on an entire community, is undeniable.
So we're left with this really unsettling image. Thomas J. Hooper, once a respected librarian, now confined to a psychiatric institution, still seemingly in contact with this mysterious void. The court reached a verdict, but did they actually achieve justice? What do you think?
Well, that's the question that sticks with you, isn't it? I mean, the legal system did what it was supposed to. They looked at the evidence, they tried to figure out if he was responsible for his actions, and then made a judgment. But in a case like this, where the whole defense revolves around something that's practically impossible to prove or disprove, it's hard to feel like there's any real closure.
It does feel like there are so many loose ends. Like, we only got a glimpse of a much bigger, more complicated story. And the fact that Hooper was still talking to this void, even after being convicted, just adds to that feeling that there's something more going on, something we might never fully understand.
Yeah, and one of the things that really gets me is that there's no clear motive, no real explanation for why the void would want Hooper to commit these crimes. If it was manipulating him, what was the point? What was the end game? That lack of a clear motive makes it even harder to dismiss his claims as just delusions.
It's like we're looking at a puzzle, but we're missing half the pieces. We could see that something really strange happened, but we can't quite grasp the whole picture.
And that feeling of unease, that nagging sense of doubt, that's what really stays with you. It forces you to confront the limits of what we know, what we can even perceive.
It's like we've been using this map to navigate reality, but suddenly we realize that there are these huge blank spots, these uncharted territories that we haven't even begun to explore.
Right, and that's why I think cases like Hooper's are so important. Not because they give us all the answers, but because they force us to question our assumptions, to acknowledge that there might be things out there that we just don't understand.
So, stepping back from the specifics of this case, what does it tell us about how our legal system handles situations where psychology, the paranormal, and the search for justice all kind of collide?
Well, it definitely highlights the limitations of our current system. I mean, our courts are designed to deal with tangible evidence, clear motives, human actions that we can understand. But what happens when you introduce something like the void, something that defies those traditional categories? It creates a real dilemma.
It does make you wonder how we as a society can even begin to approach these kinds of cases. How do we ensure justice while also remaining open to the possibility that there might be more to reality than we currently understand?
That's a huge question, and I don't think there are any easy answers. But I do think that Hooper's case serves as a really powerful reminder that the world is a much more mysterious place than we often assume, and our systems, even the ones designed to protect us and deliver justice, are still figuring out how to handle the truly strange and the unknown.
So after this deep dive into the incredibly strange case of Thomas J. Hooper and the void, we're left with more questions than answers. Was he truly controlled by a supernatural entity? Or were his experiences simply a product of his own troubled mind? We may never know for sure. But maybe that's the point.
Maybe the real value of exploring cases like this isn't about finding definitive answers, but about cultivating a sense of curiosity, a willingness to question what we think we know, and a recognition that there's still so much out there that we don't understand. And who knows, maybe that sense of wonder is the best defense we have against whatever might be lurking in the shadows, whether it's in our own minds or in the world around us.